All right. Good. Perfect. Here, hold on. I have not. Just the. Are there any extras of the other handout?
Yes.
Here you go.
Oh.
I haven't given this out yet. All right. We got that. Screen. Fire screen share. Okay. There we go. Oh, 13. Where are my courses? Courses. There we go. Courses. 13. Paste. All right, here we go. All that. Right. Yes. That's not what I need. Okay. Here we go. Copy. All right. Here we go. Nested and equivalence model. Current slide. There we go. All right. Okay, so here's the plan for today. We're going to talk about nested testing, model nesting, and equivalence using the Bentler and Satora method that we've been trying to get to for a couple weeks now. So we'll do that today. Then we're going to talk about the final. I gave you a couple of example questions, right? I just handed those out. I also made a review sheet with sort of topics that you should make sure to review. And I'll give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have. And then I think that's it. I think that's our plan for today. So let's do the nesting and equivalence before we talk about the exam. Let's get this. These slides are actually from week 12. I know, I thought they were from last week too. I thought I'd tacked them on to the end of last week, but I didn't. They're in week 12. So if you go to the end of week 12 slide, I don't know what slide this is. What slide is this? Can't see it unless I stop the slideshow. What is it?
54.
Slide 54 from week 12. Okay. So finally, we're going to talk about model nesting and equivalence. So we've already talked about this idea that, sometimes it's easy to see if you have equivalent models. Sometimes it's not so easy to see if you have equivalent models. And the same thing is true for nesting. I mean, I've given you some general rules of thumb for nesting, especially sort of when you're thinking about, sort of nested parameters. But as I said, sometimes even nesting can be difficult to ascertain. I mean, you can make it tricky enough that it's really difficult to tell if two models are equivalent or if two models are nested. Let's just remember that when we talk about a model being equivalent, that really means that the two equivalent models should produce the same model implied covariance matrix, which means they're going to produce the same residuals, which means they're going to produce the same chi-square and fit indices, right? So two models that are equivalent should actually have the same chi-square. Well, will have, not just should, will have the same chi-square, will have the same fit indices, will have the same residual matrix, and we'll have the same model implied covariance matrix. And that's really what makes the two models equivalent, is that they both result in the same model implied covariance matrix. Okay? So according to Bentler and Satora, what they say is, you know, you can sort of think of equivalent models in this way. You could think of them as models that have equal degrees of freedom, in which, like M1, let's say model 1 is nested within model 2, and simultaneously model 2 is nested within model 1. Now that's sort of a different way of thinking about nesting slightly than we're sort of used to, right? But because, you know, we've talked about nested models as having not equal degrees of freedom. And again, I mean, that nested models do not have the same degrees of freedom, but their point is sort of like, they're really thinking about this operationally, like, okay, so if we had two equivalent models, they have equal degrees of freedom, but like maybe I could actually sort of operationally test this idea of sort of nesting, right? Like if the models are equivalent, they're going to have the same degrees of freedom, but the chi-square should be the same too, right? So if you have two equivalent models, then really what should happen is it shouldn't matter which model is M1 and which model is M2. If I were to do like a chi-square difference test, I would get a chi-square of 0 with 0 degrees of freedom. And so when they say that, like, equivalent models are those with equal DF in which model 1 is nested in model 2 and model 2 is nested in model 1, that's really what they mean. Like this, there's this idea that, like, you know, if I pretended they were nested models, right? I mean, there's not going to be a chi-square change, and there's not going to be a degrees of freedom change. And it wouldn't even matter which way you go. Because remember, with nested models, we usually have a model that has more degrees of freedom, also has a bigger chi-square, right? And then that's the less parameterized model. And the more parameterized model will have a lower chi-square, and it'll have fewer degrees of freedom. And if you were testing nested models, you would really need to think about which model goes first, right? You're asking, like, is the more parameterized model nested within the simpler model, right? Or the simpler model certainly has the bigger chi-square. So when you're doing a chi-square difference test, you do, like, you know, the chi-square for the simpler model, right? Minus the chi-square for the more complex model. This has to be smaller, right? And then we've got the DF for the simpler model. This has to be bigger, right? Minus the DF for the more complex model. And, you know, to do this kind of chi-square difference testing, it matters which direction you go, right? We're always going to take the chi-square for the simpler model, subtract out the chi-square for the more complex model, so that we get a positive chi-square, right? And over here, we're always going to take the degrees of freedom for the simpler model minus the degrees of freedom for the more complex model again, so we get positive degrees of freedom. But now if you think about equivalent models, it doesn't really matter if their models are equivalent, which one you would put as, like, you don't have a simpler and a more complex model. You have two models that have equal degrees of freedom, and that's really what he means by M1 being nested in M2 and simultaneously M2 being nested in M1 is like, it doesn't really matter which one you would, you know, if you had two equivalent models, you can say the chi-square for model 1 minus the chi-square for model 2 is going to be 0, right? And also the chi-square for model 2 minus the chi-square for model 1 is going to be 0, right? And the same thing, the degrees of freedom for model 2 minus the degrees of freedom for model 1 is going to be 0. And the degrees of freedom for model 1 minus the degrees of freedom for model 2 is going to be 0. All right? Okay. Yes?
So why would they even throw in the whole, like, nested model? It seems like...
Well, because we're going to, because the way we're going to test it.
Okay.
All right. So like, basically we're going to do a series of models. So we're going to, like, kind of almost treat them as if they're nested models. Although again, you know, I don't want that to throw you for a loop before the exam, because right, nested models don't have the same degrees of freedom and equivalent models do. So don't let this little line throw you. Okay. All right. So a couple of assumptions that we need to think about before we kind of go any further. So nesting and equivalence are defined with regard to a given sort of population with means and a full rank covariance matrix. Okay, so we're sort of assuming that we've got a reasonable covariance matrix, and that we could get some sort of an empirical or simulated random sample for the population, yielding sample means and again a full rank covariance matrix. And that the variance matrix of the vector of sample moments is not going to be singular. These are very technical things, so don't worry too much about this. All the models, but this is important. I mean, again, they're technicalities, but the point is, like, if you try to do this, you have to have like a matrix that, you have to have a matrix that actually sort of theoretically works. You need to have a positive, definite matrix. You can't, again, because I'm going to show you this crazy trick. And so this is just like all the caveats. The models have to be identified. We're not going to impose any inequality constraints here, okay? And we're going to use a sample covariance matrix. So most important things here is like, yeah, okay, we've got a reasonable matrix. The matrix makes sense. You have to have a matrix that makes sense. And you have to have models that are identified, and we're not going to be using any equality constraints, which that's actually kind of important. Okay, so what are we going to do? All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to actually run these SEM models twice to determine whether we have two models that are nested or equivalent or neither, okay? And so we're going to have two models, let's say model 1 and model 2. And if the models have the same number of degrees of freedom, then they could either be equivalent or not equivalent. They're not going to be nested, right? So if you have two models that have the same degrees of freedom, they're going to be either equivalent or not equivalent. If the two models have different degrees of freedom, so now we're really asking, are these two models nested? Then model 1, M1, is going to be the model, and this is really important, the model with the larger degrees of freedom. So we're always going to start this whole process with the simpler or the more restricted model. So when the models are nested, M1 is going to be the more restricted model. If the degrees of freedom are equal, then it doesn't really matter which model you choose as M1 and which model you choose as M2. Because, right, is what I was just saying, like you're always going to get if they're equivalent, you're going to get a chi-square change of 0, you're going to get a degrees of freedom change of 0, right? So, but if you're testing for nesting and you have two models that have different degrees of freedom, you're always going to start with the model with more degrees of freedom, which is the simpler model. All right. Okay, so what are you going to do? So this is what you're going to do. You're basically going to run an SEM model on that simpler. Let's just assume we're doing nested for right now, okay? So you start and you run a normal SEM model on model 1, okay? And then you're actually going to save the model reproduced, the model implied covariance matrix, okay? And then you're going to save that covariance matrix out. And then you're going to run the second model with that model implied variance covariance matrix. And now here's the logic, okay? If these models, so let's think about this. I take like this simpler model, right? And I take the model implied variance covariance matrix from this simpler model. If I fit a more complicated nested model to that simpler model, how should it fit? And again, it's not the regular sample variance covariance matrix anymore. It's the model implied variance covariance matrix, which may or may not fit the sample variance covariance matrix, remember, but is generated from the parameters in my model. So if I have this simpler model and I get this model implied variance covariance matrix and I make a more complex model, right? So I add some more parameters, but they're nested, then I ought to be able to completely reproduce that model implied variance covariance matrix. Because the model implied variance covariance matrix was generated with like fewer parameters. Do you see the logic here? So again, I'm not going to be using the sample variance covariance matrix. I use that for the first model, but then I generate a model implied variance covariance matrix. And then I say, how well, I'm going to then pretend the model implied variance covariance matrix is basically my model, right? I mean, not my model, sorry, my data. And then I'm going to run the more complex model using that model implied variance covariance matrix. And if I really have two models that are nested, then what's going to happen is I'm going to have positive, like I'm going to have a change in the degrees of freedom that's positive, right? And I'm going to have a chi-square difference, like the chi-square is going to be 0. It's not even a chi-square difference here because I'm using the model implied variance covariance matrix, but the chi-square will actually be 0 because I'm going to be able to fit the model implied variance covariance matrix. Now that I have more parameters, I should be able to fit it perfectly. Yes.
So the chi-square difference would be 0?
No, the chi-square is going to be 0. The chi-square is going to be 0 because I'm using, again, because I'm not using the real sample variance covariance matrix anymore. I'm using the model implied variance covariance matrix. And that model implied variance covariance matrix was created using a simpler model. So obviously, just imagine this. I know this is kind of like a weird idea at first. So imagine I took the model implied variance covariance matrix that I got, and imagine I ran the same exact model through it. My model 1 again, which is in some sense like an equivalent model, right? If I ran model 1 through and I used the model implied variance covariance matrix as my data, how would that fit? Perfectly, exactly. It would fit perfectly because, right? Like that's what I got was my model implied variance covariance matrix. That's what I got from using the model I had. So now if I just basically took that model implied variance covariance matrix and ran my model through it, I would get perfect fit, right? Yeah? So, okay, so the logic is if I do that and I take a model that's like a more parameterized nested model, I'm still going to get perfect fit, right? Because the more parameterized model is more complex. So, right, like think about what happens. Like, when we have a just identified model, we have 0 degrees of freedom, right? We have a chi-square of 0. And as we get more and more parameterized, right, our fit is getting better, our chi-square is going down, we're better able to reproduce our variance covariance matrix, right? And so in this case, I'm basically just taking the model implied variance covariance matrix, and then I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to treat this variance covariance matrix as if it is the data. And if my new model, which is, more complex, if it really is nested, when I run this, my chi-square should be 0. And in fact, that's going to be true too. If it's an equivalent model, then the degrees of freedom are going to be the same as they were for the first model, right? But I should still get a chi-square of 0. So basically, if I take this model implied variance covariance matrix and I run it with something I think is an equivalent model, I'm going to get a chi-square of 0. And obviously, those two models would have the same degrees of freedom because they're equivalent, right? If I run it with a nested model that I think is more complex, those two models that I'm running don't have the same degrees of freedom. They have different degrees of freedom, but the chi-square using that model implied variance covariance matrix is still going to be 0. Yeah? Follow the logic? So basically, the logic is, okay, if I do this, if I run a model, get this model implied variance covariance matrix, and then use that model implied variance covariance matrix as the data instead of the data itself, I can very easily test whether I have an equivalent model, a nested model, or neither. If it's an equivalent or a nested model, this new model, this model 2, I'm going to get a chi-square of 0, right? And I'm going to know whether it's equivalent or nested because if it's an equivalent model, the two models I ran have the same degrees of freedom, right? And if it's a nested model, the two models I ran have different degrees of freedom. And again, we're really sort of interested in the difference in the degrees of freedom here when we're comparing, you know, where it says here, like compute D equals DF1 minus DF2, right? We're really interested in like the difference in the degrees of freedom rather than the degrees of freedom themselves. Now, you know, there could be, and they talk about this idea that like, you know, okay, will it always be exactly 0? Like maybe it'll be something really, 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 you know, like what is exactly 0, right? So he sort of suggests setting up a criterion like, you know, chi-square of less than, you know, 0.0001 or something really, really, really small. So basically, you know, it's going to be essentially 0. I mean, M plus usually only gives you to 3 decimal places. So it's going to look like a chi-square of 0. But I mean, is it like in its internal bowels 0, or could it be like, you know, whatever, 0.001 because, or something, right? Whatever. But for our purposes, we're going to call it 0. Okay, do you follow the logic? It's very clever, actually. Yes. Sure.
So the model implied variance covariance that we get out of one, we're using to run the model for it.
That's right.
And it should fit perfectly if it's nested because the variance that still was left alone based on model 1 is being soaked up by the parameters.
Right, like whatever we did, like our model 2 is basically the same as model 1, but with just some extra parameters.
That are soaking up the variance that
Yeah, exactly.
model 1 did not touch because they weren't.
Right. And so, and this model implied variance covariance matrix, like it would, right? I could take the same model and run it again and I would get a perfect chi-square, or I could take any model that's nested that has additional parameters and it's still going to fit perfectly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Does that make sense? All right. So that's the logic. I think I said all this. So obviously, if you do this, so let's say you do this and, you know, your model 2 doesn't have a chi-square of 0, then your two models are neither nested nor equivalent, right? But you'll know whether you were testing for nesting or equivalence because the two models would have had the same degrees of freedom if you're testing for equivalence. The two models would have different degrees of freedom if you're testing for nesting. But either way, if you don't get a chi-square of 0, then your two models are not nested and they're not equivalent. Yeah.
So when you're starting off on the journey of taking the model 1, model implied variance covariance matrix, and using it as the data set for model 2, at that point, you don't know if it's nested or equivalent or not.
I mean, theoretically, no, you don't know. Because otherwise, why would you do this if you did, right? So you don't know. Like, I mean, I think in the, you know, you could do this with models that you know to be nested, but there wouldn't be much point in it.
I feel like my point is there's nothing that would give you like a hunch that it's equivalent over nested or nested over equivalent.
Oh, no, you know that part. Because remember, you're testing for equivalence if the models have the same number of parameters. So they have the same number of degrees of freedom. So you always know whether you're looking for nesting or equivalence based on the number of degrees of freedom in the two models. So if the two models that you're comparing have the same degrees of freedom, then you're testing for equivalence. If the two models that you're looking at do not have the same degrees of freedom, then you're looking at nesting. And this is where it becomes, like, if you're considering two equivalent models, and this is kind of what that like little sort of thing that Bentler was saying on the first thing about the nested within. If you're looking at two equivalent models and they have the same degrees of freedom, it doesn't matter which model you choose for M1 because they have the same degrees of freedom. So whether you choose, whichever model you choose, it doesn't matter, right? But if you're doing this for nested models, these two models you're comparing are going to have different degrees of freedom. And then it's going to be really important that you start with the more parsimonious model. Because think about it, you got to get the chi-square. You got to get the model implied variance covariance matrix from the more parsimonious model. And then you fit this other model that has extra parameters to it, and it should fit at least as well. And so it's going to have a chi-square of 0. If you inadvertently did it the other way around and you started with the more complex model, right, and then got that model implied variance covariance matrix and then fit the simpler model, you wouldn't actually get a chi-square of 0 anymore because the simpler model has fewer parameters, right? And so the model implied variance covariance matrix you got from the more parameterized model, you probably wouldn't be able to completely reproduce with the simpler model.
But to have degrees of freedom upon which to know if you're testing for equivalence or nesting, you have already ran model 2. You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you know that the degrees of freedom in model 2 are the same of the degrees of freedom in model 1 if you haven't ran them both to begin with?
Well, you could always count the degrees of freedom, right?
So we're counting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
On the previous slide where it says that when models are nested, M1 is the more restricted model.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's also the model with a larger DF.
Yeah, that's also right. The more restricted model is the model that is estimating fewer parameters. And if it's estimating fewer parameters, it has more degrees of freedom.
Okay, I think I got mixed
And it will
up.
have a higher chi-square. Yeah, more. So it has. So it is. Yeah. It is the more constrained model, right? Is the one that has more degrees of freedom, higher chi-square, fewer parameters estimated. Yeah. Okay. And that's the one we want to start with. That's our model 1. And then we're going to compare that to model 2, which is going to have, it's going to have fewer degrees of freedom. It's going to have more estimated parameters, right? All right. Okay, so let's just do a simple example of this. And this actually comes from, with any luck, let's see. I think I gave this sheet out a while back. Let me see if I have extras of it. I have a couple extra of these sheets, but not classes worth. If anybody needs one, let me know. Okay, here. Okay, so these are not like super extremely difficult models here. But here are our models, okay? And the question is, are these nested models? I suppose we could say, are they nested models or are they equivalent models or neither? So let's start by looking and seeing like, okay, how many, let's start with model, it doesn't say model A. Model A is the first one. I don't know why it doesn't say model A above it, but model A is the first one, then model B, then model C. It does say it on the piece of paper. Somehow it got cut off here. Okay, so the question is, how many degrees of freedom are there in model A? Let's start there. How many degrees of freedom do we have in model A? Anybody else? And what's the easiest way to figure this out, by the way? What strategy are you using to come up with this? Okay, count it. You could do the knowns minus the unknowns. I mean, this is a nice simple path model. So an easy way to go about this is, remember, a just identified model, fully saturated, is going to have one linkage between each and every pair, each pair of variables, right? Either correlation or a path. So, I mean, because this is just a simple structural model, one of the things we can do is just say, okay, well, how far are we from being just identified? So where do we not have linkages, right? Where are we getting, because those are going to be the places where we're like gaining degrees of freedom. So tell me which pairs of variables aren't linked here. Yeah, so x1 and y2, x2 and y1, x2 and y3. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Is the double-headed arrow between x1 and x2 saying if there's a path from x1 to x2 and then x2 to x1?
No, that's correlation. Double-headed arrow is always a correlation.
Okay.
But that's a linkage, right?
And plus showed it at like the.
Oh my gosh, that threw us
So-
around.
What?
You can move it, but it like defaulted to look like that. The recursive.
Oh, when you're doing the path, yeah. Sorry about that, but I can't ever swear by, and Plus's graphics are not great. But anyway, yeah, so normally though, a double-headed arrow like that is gonna just be a correlation. Okay, so we've got no links here. So how many degrees of freedom? 3. Okay, great. So now let's take a look at Model B and Model C. So Model B, how many degrees of freedom? Where are there not linkages?
X2 and Y3.
X2 and Y3. Okay, and it's 1 degree of freedom, right? And now what about, oh, that's kind of annoying down there. But now what about, let me move this. Where did my thing go? There it is. Okay, there we go. What about our Model C? 2 degrees of freedom, right? Because we don't have a linkage between x1 and y3. And the other one is what? x2 and y3? Is that right?
Yeah.
Right? And so now we have 2 degrees of freedom. Okay, so are we testing whether any of these models are equivalent? No, right? Because none of the models have the same number of degrees of freedom, so we're not testing for equivalence, we're testing for nesting. So that's the first thing. Like, you're going to know if you're comparing 2 models that have different degrees of freedom, you're asking, are they nested or not nested? If you're comparing 2 models that have the same degrees of freedom, then you're asking, are they equivalent or not equivalent? Okay, so given what I said, which model is going to be our Model 1, our first model that we fit and get a model implied variance covariance matrix from? Yeah, Model A. It's got to be Model A. It's the one that has the fewest parameters. It has the greatest degrees of freedom. It's going to be the most restricted of these 3 models. So Model A is going to be our baseline model, and we're going to compare Model A to Model B, and we're going to compare Model A to Model C to see if Model A and B are nested models, and to see if Model A and C are nested models. And I mean, we could theoretically also see if models B and C are nested models. We're not gonna do that today. We're just gonna do A and B, A and C. All right, does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's see here. I think that's my last slide on this. Oh, no, I guess it's not. I'll just show you the M+ code. So this is important. So the first thing we're going to do is, we're just going to fit this model, Model A, just the way that we always would. But the only real difference is that we're going to put in this command that's save data. So save data colon, and then we're going to save out that covariance matrix. So we say save data covariance equals, and I just called it M1 underscore A. So it's like model A is our model 1 here. That's why I called it that. Then in the next step, we are going to use that same variance covariance matrix that we just generated. That's the model implied variance covariance matrix. And we have to tell it the type is covariance, right? And then we're gonna fit the model of interest. So either the model B or model C. And then one really important thing to keep in mind that's a little bit weird, but when you do this, when M plus saves out that model implied variance covariance matrix, it's going to save out the endogenous variables first. Whether or not the endogenous variables were first in your original data file. And this is a really important thing to keep in mind, because obviously, if you don't have the data, if you don't have the variables in the right order, then you're not going to get the right chi-square, right? And nothing's going to look like it's nested or equivalent, because you're going to have the variables in the wrong order, and so that'll be a mess. So just remember, like over here, you can see I had like x1, x2, y1, y2, y3. But then when I came to this generate, sort of this model 2, notice that when I'm using this covariance matrix, I say names are y1, y2, y3, x1, x2, because the endogenous variables show up first in that model implied variance covariance matrix. And then the exogenous variables. It'll otherwise just follow the same order that you had, but endogenous variables will start first. Yeah.
There any way to like see this, like have it show you like a part of the table, like how it's listed?
You could probably get at that by looking at the output that you get from model 1. Yeah, right. Because you're saving out the model implied variance covariance matrix. So you can just ask for the residuals, right? And you can see your model implied variance covariance matrix. And then you can double check. Yeah. But that is just kind of a weird, quirky thing that it's important to keep in mind, because that will mess everything up. All right, that's the end of our show. Good. No, I don't want to save any of that. Okay, so let's actually do this. All right. Here we go. So, you go into the courses folder, you'll find in week 14, there's a folder called net. Okay, and then in net, you'll find, hold on. No, let me do this. Let me go with M plus first. M plus. Okay. There we go. Open. Desktop. So week 14. Net. Okay, so here we go. So this is actually the first data file. Or not data, input file. Well, there's data too, but this is the first input file for model 1. And it's literally that model that we were just looking at on the PowerPoint slide. So we've got our data file. It's a covariance matrix. And here's our model. So you can check that it's actually the same as model A. And then we're going to save out this covariance matrix from this sort of like more restricted model, model 1. I'm just going to call it model 1 underscore A. All right. So I can do this. I run the model. And I mean, I get output. Let's see here. Let's look at our chi-square tested model fit. Actually, this model fits really well, even though it has 3 degrees of freedom. The chi-square tested model fit here is 0.065 with 3 degrees of freedom. It's not statistically significant. All my fit indices look really, really good, right? Now, don't let this throw you. This just happens to be a chi-square that's close to 0, but there's no reason that this chi-square would necessarily be close to 0. This just happens to be a really good fitting model. Okay, so that's the first step. And then we get, again, we've generated this data file, m1_a.dat. Let's see, where's my, that's not where it was. I have too many things open up here. Hold on. Week 14, net. There it is. So here it is. It just generated this, m1_a.dat. So this is the data file for the model implied variance covariance matrix. Okay? So the next step is we want to go into M+, and we want to fit model 2. Any guesses, by the way? What do you think? Do you think model 2 is going to be nested or not nested?
Sorry, but where does it save it?
Where does it save it? It should save it in the same folder where you were working. So let's see. Hold on. I have a lot of things opened up here, but I was working in the week 14 folder here, I think. In net.
Okay, model 1A, DAT.
Yeah, m1_a.dat.
And if this wasn't preloaded, would we have, like, when we're doing this at home by ourselves, would it have, like, open up something new or have saved something new?
I didn't preload that M1. It just ran it. Here, watch. Watch this. Delete. Okay, just deleted it. Okay. Let's go back and do that again. Okay, run. Okay, now week 14, net. There it is again. See? So yeah, it's totally creating that data file. That's what the save data command does. And that's really kind of the point of this first model, is that now I've created this model implied variance covariance matrix that I'm going to use, and I'm going to use it, and I'm going to run the second model that I'm interested in, but I'm going to use this model implied variance covariance matrix instead of the actual data. So for model B, does anybody have any guesses? Do you think model B is nested or not nested? What do you think? Nested. Why do you think nested? Okay, well, it does have fewer degrees of freedom, but also when we kind of listed what the constraints were, remember, right? It had only 1 degree of freedom, but it sort of, model A had 2 constraints that model B didn't have, right? But model B and model A, for that 1 degree of freedom, did actually have the same constraint, right? And model A added 2 constraints on top of that, so it kind of makes sense, right? That these models should be nested. Okay, so now let's run it and see. Let's open up. So go to File, Open, and now we want to look at M2 model B. Okay. So here, again, first really important thing, don't use the data file. Use the model implied variance covariance matrix. So here it is. File is m1_a.dat, right? And then I'm using model B, the model B setup here. And the other really important thing is notice that the order of the variables now has the endogenous variables coming first. So we've got y1, y2, y3, then x1 and x2. All right, so I'm going to run this model. Boom, it's done. Now I go to my output. And really, I mean, we're not even really interested in our out, you know, like our parameters here for right now. We're just kind of interested in, you know, comparing these two models, right? Okay, so this model has 1 degree of freedom. So really, the chi-square difference between this model and the last model is 2 degrees of freedom, right? And look at the chi-square test of model fit. What do you notice? It's 0. It's like perfectly 0. So what does that tell us? Yeah, these two models are nested, right? Different degrees of freedom, but when I use the model implied variance covariance matrix from that more restricted model, and I do this more parameterized model, it fits perfectly. So these two models are nested. Yeah? Okay, so now let's do model C. And we're going to use the same model C. By the way, I noticed, not that it really matters, but I noticed in the run that I did, I think I handed out this to you like in week 12, I had a correlation between, where's my picture? Yeah, here it is. I had a correlation between X1 and Y2. I thought that was a double-headed arrow. But actually, I think it might be, I'm not sure. I think it might be a path. As it turns out, and it doesn't actually matter whether it's a correlation between X1 and the disturbance of Y2, or if it's a path from X1 to Y2, because those two models are actually statistically equivalent. So whether I make that a path or a covariance, I'm going to get the same answer here. But just FYI, I did actually, I think where it says model C _ 2022, the change here is that I changed that from a correlation to a path. But it's not going to change our chi-square or our degrees of freedom at all. Would make an interesting example to do for two equivalent models, I guess. But okay. So remember, this model has 2 degrees of freedom. And we said that there was no path from X1 to Y3 and no path from X2 to Y3. I think. Is that what we said? I believe that's what we said. Okay. So now, same thing we're going to do here. File equals M1 _ A. So we're using the same model implied variance covariance matrix. We've now replaced, now we've got model C in here. And we're going to run our model. Run it, and what do you see? Does it fit perfectly? Dun, dun, dun. Nope. Like, yeah, not at all. Again, and it won't always necessarily be this huge a difference either. Like, it doesn't have to be 200 points. You know, anything above 0 is not 0. But in this case, you can see, like, wow, this model has a chi-square of 224.54 with 2 degrees of freedom. Right, using that model implied variance covariance matrix. And actually, if you come down and look at the residual matrix, you can kind of see, you know, you can actually see where, like, the residuals for the covariances and the correlations, you can kind of see where we're doing a really lousy job sort of reproducing those particular covariances. So, are these two models nested? No, definitely not, right? And that's it. And again, you could do the same thing with 2 equivalent models, but you know, they would have the same degrees of freedom. So it wouldn't matter which one you chose as your M1 and which one you chose as your M2. You do the same thing. If you get a chi-square of 0, they're equivalent models. If the chi-square is not 0, they're not equivalent models. Yeah.
Look at the model diagrams. Is that because we added something or removed something else?
Yeah. Well, exactly. So look at the model diagrams, right? So yeah, we had no path from X2 to Y3, no path from x1 to y3. So yeah, look at the no path from x1 to y3 for model C. We did have actually a linkage there, didn't we, from x1 to y3? So in model A, we had a path there that we eliminated, right? And then in model A, let's see, we had no path from x2 to y1, right? But now we do. So exactly, when you look at A and C, you can see that like we had a path that we eliminated, and then we sort of like had an eliminated path that we added, right? So you can literally, like, you can really see it. This is a pretty easy example. You can really see here that model C with 2 degrees of freedom is not just like a slightly more parameterized version of model A. You can see that we've actually traded out constraints. You know, we're constraining x1 to x3 to be 0 now, right? But we also, we are. But then we also have from x1 to x2, we now have that relationship in there, right? So you can't simply go from like model A to model C by just adding. That's really what you would need. It's just like for them to be nested, to go from model A to model C, you'd just be like adding a parameter, right? Sort of like releasing a constraint or adding a parameter. But that's not what we have here. We have like a mishmash of some added and some constrained or deleted. So like you could have figured this. I mean, this is not so hard. These are relatively simple examples that you should be able to kind of figure out. But it is nice to be able to confirm it, you know. And again, there can be examples of models that are really, really complicated, for which it's not so obvious whether they are equivalent or nested or neither. So for the extra credit homework assignment that is posted, which is worth up to 4 points, they're relatively simple models, and I just ask you to explain whether they're nested, equivalent, or neither, and then confirm that with the net test. So there'd be no reason to get those wrong, because you know after the right, even if you guess wrong at first, you'll know after the net test. Yeah.
So, more saturated and more parameters.
That's right. More saturated means you're estimating more parameters, which means you have fewer degrees of freedom, right? Which also means you're going to have a lower chi-square. Yes?
So my question is more about conceptually.
Okay.
So we learned about equivalent models to basically incorporate about trying to say this is causal, right?
Yeah.
Because you could change the way that looks in relationships. For nested models, how is that helping us to clarify that?
Well, we don't have that same caveat with nested models, right? I mean, with nested models, we are really testing whether we can constrain those particular parameters to be 0. So like when you think about it, when we have 2 nested models, if I say, for example, okay, let's say I have a model like this, where I have like, let's make it something simple. So let's say it's like A, B, C, right? And okay, so here's that's a just identified model too, but here's my first model, right? And then let's say that my second model constrains the direct effect of A on C to be equal to 0. Those 2 models are nested, right? And I'm actually learning something really important. If I can fit this model and it fits as well as the model where I don't constrain that path to be equal to 0, then that indicates that I don't need this path. The direct effect is basically essentially 0. So I do have complete mediation, right? So yeah, I mean, so from the perspective of being able to say interesting things about our models and make some stronger statements, we're much better shape when we've got sets of nested models, right? Equivalent models are kind of the bane of our existence, but building sets of nested models does allow us to actually say things, right? Just kind of the way we've been doing all semester, where we've kind of come up with these sets of nested models. And, you know, that allows us to actually do this model, like hypothesis testing and model building and model testing. Yeah.
So the way that I was initially trying to count degrees of freedom was the knowns and unknowns.
Mhm.
So like just think about paths that aren't there.
Well, for the structural model here, I think that's really easy. Yeah. It would be really hard if it were a hybrid model to do that, right? Like, what if it were a hybrid model with a whole like measurement aspect?
Okay.
I would not suggest doing it in that case. I would definitely suggest like thinking about knowns and unknowns. But in this case, because it really was like a pretty simple structural model, I think just easier to look at, like, well, where are there not linkages, right?
Well, we can use that logic as long as we're dealing with a purely structural model.
Or if you're just thinking about it in terms of, remember, even with a hybrid model, I could ask, you know, you could think about like how many degrees of freedom are there in the structural part of the model, right? And we could still use that same logic if we're just talking about the structural part of the model.
Okay.
But like if you were doing anything with measurement models,
Okay.
trying to count all the places there aren't linkages. I mean, think about it, right? Because you got all these little variables, you got factor. I mean, it would be such a pain. You would not, you could do it, but it would be horrible. So I would not recommend it for measurement models. Yeah.
So one more question about the constraining parameterized models. Like, so if we're adding a constraint, like we're adding this path to be 1 or 0 or whatever, that's us giving it more degrees of freedom. But if we're adding a path, that's the opposite. Right?
Yeah. So just, you know, so I like to think of this as, you know, when you first see these path diagrams, when you first start looking at SEM, you sort of think that the story is where all the paths are, but actually the story is where the paths aren't, because that's actually where we're making these constraints that could actually cause our model not to fit, right? So if I have a path, I mean, think about it. If I have a path here, okay? So let's say I've got this path. I've got this path from A to C, okay? All this is saying is allow for there to be a direct effect from A to C, right? So it's like it's like a regression coefficient, which is really just how well does A predict C after controlling for B, because I have this in here, right? This number could be anything. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be 0. I can put this path in here and I could estimate this model, and this could end up being 0. So like there's no constraint on it when I have the path there. I'm just like, hey, allow for there to be a direct effect. It could be anything, right? But as soon as I say, no, I'm not putting a path there, right? Now, by not putting a path there, I really am saying, after controlling for the effect of B on C, there is no like effect of A on C. Sorry, that there's no direct effect of A on C. That there's the partial regression coefficient, right, of A on C after controlling for B is 0. Right? And so that is a constraint that I'm making. And the degree to which that doesn't fit is actually what's contributing to, like, that is my 1 degree of freedom, right? And you can kind of work it out and figure out, you know, what does that say about the model implied? I mean, well, what does that say about the model implied correlation? Let's just think about correlations. What does that say about the model implied correlation between A and C using the tracing rule? Let's say this is an A path and this is a B path. We'll call those A and B. So if I don't allow for a path here, right, I'm really saying that the model implied the R implied, right, between A and C is equal to A times B, right? So like whatever those two paths are, like those need to reproduce the model implied correlation between A and C. if I allow for there to be that path, so let's do this again. Right, so I've got this path, and this path. If I allow for that to be that path to be there, so let's say this is A, B, and C. If I allow for that path, now I'm saying the model implied correlation between A and C is A times B plus C, right? And C is whatever's left over, you know, some sense, right? So this obviously, whoops, what did I just do? I don't know. Where'd it go? Hold on. All right, well, that's fine. Let's go back here. So this is the more constrained model, right? It's just, I'm saying that model implied correlation is equal to A times B. In the second one, I'm saying the correlation is equal to A times B plus C. Sort of stands to reason. Should be easier to fit this, right? Like here, whatever I'm getting for A and B, they have to not just be able to sort of get me to the correlation between A and B and the correlation between B and C, but they also have to be able to reproduce the correlation between A and C, that model implied correlation, and it has to just be a function of A's relationship with B and B's relationship with C, right? So this is a much tougher model in some sense, right? Than if I add this path. Now, these things can be anything. Anything will fit, right? And it is, it's just identified. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So one of my review questions is pretty related to this.
Okay, so go for it.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like constraints are basically deleted paths.
Well, you know, so technically we can have constraints other than deleted paths, right? Because we can constrain things to be equal. We can delete paths. We could constrain things to be something other than zero. Like a deleted path is just a constraint that path is zero. You could theoretically constrain the path to be something else besides zero. We don't do that very often, although we do it a lot in multiple groups where we don't necessarily constrain the path to be equal to zero, but we constrain the two paths to be equal to each other. So when we constrain, it just means we're not, when I say something about constraining, it means we're not freely estimating it. We're constraining it to something.
So then, whenever we talk about overriding,
Mm-hmm.
is that similar where it's a particular type of that is? Because I thought those were just omitted paths, so that's just a particular.
Well, yeah, when we were talking about so earlier in the semester, and a lot of times when we've talked about over-identifying restrictions, we have actually, you're right, we've deleted a path or something like that, which means that we're, again, think about deleted paths as really saying, I'm constraining that to be zero, right? So I'm not allowing for there to be any direct path from, just like we were saying. So what was the second part of that question, though?
I'm just trying to figure out, like there are several types of things. I see that referring to friction, like, do I know that means that's a path constraint, or would that also be, you're constraining other things like factor loadings to be set equal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. So usually when I use the term over-identifying restriction, I think I've usually used it sort of for structural models where we're like constraining some path to be, some direct effect to be equal to zero. I mean, technically, I suppose it is also an over-identifying restriction in a multiple groups model if I constrain the two intercepts to be equal across the two groups, you know, but it's not, I mean, so that's not untrue, but I mean, I think when I talk about it, I'm usually thinking of it more in like a path analysis framework. Is that? Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to know.
Yeah. So if I'm talking about over-identifying restrictions, that's like the perfect example is what we just did. The over-identifying restriction there with that little mediation model was that we're really saying that we need to be able to completely reproduce the correlation between A and C with the, you know, using the A path and the B path, right? So A times B needs to reproduce the correlation between A and C, right? So our over-identifying so that's an over-identifying restriction there, right? All right. Other questions about net before we get into the sort of meat of the review? Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about part of what you said in the notes was how longitudinal models and the overload factors, there's less competing models.
Say that again. Longitudinal models, what?
Sorry, I'm trying to find exactly what you said. So basically, like one of the strengths of longitudinal models is there's less nested and equivalent models.
Oh, yeah. So the logic there is just, and again, just with the caveat that just because it's longitudinal doesn't mean it solves all the world's problems, right? But the idea is like, when we're thinking about things like reverse causation, right? It doesn't make sense if I collect, this variable today and I collect this next variable next year. Like, it does not make sense to actually reverse the causal arrows there, because like, how could the thing tomorrow cause where I am today? Having said that, some people have done some interesting studies, like in the value-added modeling literature. There was this really famous study where they basically, how did they do this? They basically created VAMs for 1 year and used them to predict something for the prior year, right? And they found that they could, which of course was like problematic, right? There's sort of a validity issue. So again, like theoretically, it doesn't make sense to go from like this year to last year with a causal path. But the caveat there is like, again, if I collect self-concept this year and I collect your achievement next year, and I'm saying self-concept causes achievement, but maybe it was that your prior achievement caused you to have higher self-concept, which then led to greater achievement down the road. Like just because you measured them at two different points in time, it like doesn't necessarily mean that the one you measured first really is the causal variable. So like I just give that as a caveat, but it is true that with longitudinal models, it does limit the number, like it just doesn't even make sense to reverse the causal arrow there, right? Yeah, it doesn't mean that your model's right, but it means that it does eliminate the number of like potential equivalent models that make sense. Obviously, to sort of counter what I just said, the thing you should do is measure self-concept and achievement at both time points, right? Because then that'll give you a lot more flexibility to model something that makes sense.
So, just to kind of like counter that with because a lot of times, in literature I read, to avoid common method bias, they recommend staggering it like that and not measuring it at the same time. And so I've always been confused by that, because what you said makes more sense to me, rather than what has been some recommended.
So how frequently are they measuring the variables that they're saying to stagger and not measure at the same time? Just once each. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, I think these are probably places where reasonable people sort of disagree about design stuff. But yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen that too, right? People will collect like, a predictor variable and a mediator and an outcome variable, and they collect the mediator between, time one and whatever, this time and this time and this time. But like that, again, that doesn't make it so just because you've done that. So yeah, I tend to like to collect things multiple times. But I mean, I guess the downside to collecting things multiple times can be if you think that there is going to be some sort of do you think there's going to be some sort of practice effect, or do you think there's going to be some sort of is there some reason that you feel like the validity excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat. Do you think there's some reason the validity is going to be compromised, by measuring it multiple times? All right. All right. So I think that moves us on to exam questions, right? Yeah. Okay. So I made your final review sheet. One more, sorry.
The same one on the PC.
It's the same one on Husky. You got it? Okay. Thank you. Let me send that this way. 1, 2, 3. There we go.
I've been doing it. We need 4.
I need 4. Here you go, sorry. Did everybody get one? Are there enough going down that way? Need one more?
No, she hasn't.
Okay. I was gonna say, because I have one extra here too.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. So next week is the final. Yay! Well, yay. It'll all be over after this time next week, right? Well, not quite this time next week. Okay. So I gave you a couple of multiple choice questions. We can talk about those in a minute if you want. But let's start by looking at the review sheet. Okay. So, I mean, I kind of went through what I think are the big ideas, and also what are the things that are covered on the exam. And so big topics that certainly you should be really comfortable with, like, so what are some advantages of SEM models? Identification. I mean, this is sort of a bigger, this is a big one, right? Identification of SEM models. And that includes being able to count the number of knowns and unknowns and compute the degrees of freedom, to understand identification for structural recursive models, to understand identification issues for non-recursive models, and to understand identification issues for measurement or CFA models. And part of that includes understanding how we scale the latent variable for CFA models. Remember, we have that choice of the marker variable strategy or the fixed factor variance strategy. And of course, I think I mentioned this later on. When we get to multiple group CFA models, right, then you've got to think about things like the intercepts, right? And so you should know the tracing rules, and you should be able to use the tracing rules to figure out what the model implied correlations are, and the direct, indirect, and total effects. And you should certainly know what the difference between model implied correlations and direct, and total effects are, right? And how those differ in terms of the computations using the tracing rules. You should be able to, if I gave you a set of equations, you should be able to draw a path diagram from those equations. And if I gave you a path diagram, you ought to be able to create equations from that path diagram. So it's sort of similar to the kinds of stuff we did the first couple of weeks. Again, I don't expect you to be Bentler type experts on nesting and nested models, but I do expect you to understand the basics of nesting and nested models, especially when it comes to, we talked about the fact that it's pretty easy to see nested models in terms of, when you add when you add a parameter, or you do, if you add a parameter, or you make an additional constraint, right? Then, you've got these two nested models. But if you're like, adding constraints, and then you're, also relaxing constraints in another part of the model, then those are not nested models. I would expect you to understand that. I also mentioned that, like, sometimes nesting isn't so obvious, because even though the models don't look nested, they actually, or they don't look equivalent. They might actually result in the same model implied variance covariance matrix if they're equivalent, or they might actually be nested models, but it's sort of not obvious until you kind of work everything out into the model implied variance covariance matrix. I'm not going to give you anything like that. Right? If I'm asking you about nested models, they're going to be more like obvious. Does this set of parameters look like it's nested in this set of parameters kind of models, not like super tricky, work out all the covariance algebra and see that there's some sort of glitch there. No, I'm not going to do that. That would be ridiculous and mean. Same with equivalent models, right? I expect you to understand a little something about equivalent models. Understand things like any completely saturated model is going to be equivalent with any other completely saturated model, right? So like if there are 0 degrees of freedom in the structural model, no matter how you put together a structural model with 0 degrees of freedom, all of those structural models are going to be equivalent. So, you know, those kinds of things. But again, I'm not going to kind of try to trick you into, you know, can you find, it's not going to be anything super tricky about equivalent models either. You should certainly understand about chi-square difference testing, and model fit. You need to understand about measurement and structural models, right? And remember, we did talk about thinking about sort of counting the degrees of freedom in the measurement model, counting the degrees of freedom in the structural model, right? And sort of thinking about how sort of the degrees of freedom for a hybrid model really are sort of a combination of those two sets of degrees of freedom. Was there a question about that?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna, I don't know, if you want me to go through the whole thing and then you can ask, or I was gonna ask something about fit indices.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just go through this and then we'll come back to the fit index question. Okay, and then mean structure, right? Remember, we talked about mean structure in two different contexts. We talked about it in the context of growth models, and we talked about it in the context of multiple group CFA and SEM. And then just to sort of remind you, the types of models that we talked about where they're, you know, that you want to be sort of comfortable with. We talked about, obviously, measurement and CFA models, mediational models, autoregressive longitudinal models, growth curve models, multiple group CFA and SEM, non-recursive models. Oh, and then I put measurement models again, but I guess I was just reminding you with measurement models, remember we talked about congeneric, tau equivalent, and parallel models. And with multiple group CFA or multiple groups measurement models, we talked about configural, metric, and scalar invariance across the two groups, which sometimes people get those two things mixed up, you know, those two types of constraints. Remember that congeneric, tau equivalent, and parallel, those are all constraints that are happening. They're happening, you know, like within a group. We're actually making constraints on the loadings, for example, right? The loadings and the errors within a single group, whereas configural, metric, and scalar invariance, those all involve constraints across two groups, right? So you could actually have a congeneric measurement model that is scalar, you know, is scalarly invariant or whatever, or you could have a parallel model that, you know, or you can't impose invariance across two groups or whatever. So, I mean, those two things actually can be combined. You can have within group constraints and across group constraints. All right, so those are kind of the big picture topics, I think. Let's talk about questions. So you had a question about model fit.
Yeah, so when we're looking at fit indices, chi-square difference test, when they're inconsistent, right? So when one, like the RMSA might be, you know, exceed kind of benchmarks, but the SRMR doesn't. How, and I mean that typically hasn't come up until the last homework, I guess it was.
No, it happens all the time though, in real life, right? Yeah. So, okay. So first off, you should be cautious of those benchmarks for model fit in the same way that you should be cautious of, you know, having some sort of threshold for alpha, right? All of those benchmarks are kind of made up. And well, they're based on this study that Hugh and Bentler did with a very particular type of model. And they said, gee, if you're using this CFA model and the loadings have about this magnitude, blah, 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 this is where you get good fit. This is where you get, you know, not so good fit. I think I mentioned briefly that Dan McNeish has kind of generated this Shiny app where you can actually go in and sort of, you know, basically get some metrics for your model, which is kind of cool. We'll see if it catches on. I mean, I hope it does actually. But I think the more important point still than that is just that, like, the measures of model fit, they measure different things. So like CFI and TLI are incremental fit indices. So that means it's not just looking at like how close, you know, sort of the fit of your model and how it might compare to the completely saturated model, but it's also looking at like, what's the worst possible model, like, right? And so it's kind of really scaling your model from like, what's the worst possible model fit that you could get, right? Like, so what's the baseline model, like, and what's the best possible model fit you could get, which is obviously going to be like completely saturated model or whatever. And where do you sort of fit in there? That's very different from something like the RMSEA, which is an absolute fit index, you know, and the RMSE, I mean, and each of these model fit equations, I mean, they work slightly differently, right? And the SRMR is really about, it's really about the standardized residuals, like how big are the, you know, if you were to sort of standardize the residuals from the variance covariance matrix, like how big are these residuals, which I kind of like that kind of makes sense to me, because we're always trying to reproduce the variance covariance matrix, right? But that's, you know, and they all perform differently for different types of models, so and for different sample sizes. So the reality is that it's not very uncommon to find that different measures of model fit give you different ideas about whether something fits well or not. So my very pragmatic advice going forward is you should report multiple measures of model. You should always report chi-square, always. Even though we know that there are problems with chi-square, you should always report chi-square. You should always report degrees of freedom, obviously. In addition to that, you should always report multiple measures of model fit. And you should report different kinds of measures of model fit. So RMSEA is very popular. So I would say you should always report RMSEA. And you should probably always report either TLI or CFI. I would say CFI is more popular than TLI. So if I were going to choose one, I'd probably choose CFI. And then, you know, I think it's a good idea to report SRMR too, because again, those are three really different types of fit indices, right? And so, you know, if you report your chi-square and your degrees of freedom and you report those three different types of fit indices, then you're giving people sort of the information that they need to make a judgment about whether your model fits well. And it isn't uncommon that one of those three measures might look worse or better than the others. But again, I think that's why looking at them in combination is really, really helpful. I don't know if does that help?
In terms of, I guess, more so in terms of comparing different models, you know.
Well, when we compare nested models, I think we're better off, generally speaking. If we're comparing nested models, we're better off comparing them in terms of the chi-square difference test.
Right. Like, so for our last, so we were doing the continuary equivalent parallel, right? That was when we got into the differences. And one had a better RMSEA, one had a better SRMR, and right, and then it sounds like there's really no, like, there's not any.
Well, again, but those are nested models. So in that case, I would really look at the chi-square difference test. I would prioritize the chi-square difference test over the changes in the model fit criteria. Where you'll get in trouble is like, where that doesn't work so well is if you either have unbelievably large sample sizes, like really, really large, because then the chi-square difference test doesn't work so well. But I mean, generally speaking, for the kinds of studies we have, we're not going to, a few hundred, that's fine. I'm talking like 100, if you have 100,000 people in your sample, chi-square difference test is not going to work well for you. Or if you don't have nested models, right? If you don't have nested models, then you don't have much of a choice. And there is research literature suggesting, like, for example, with multiple group CFA, there's a paper by, I think it's Chen et al., it's probably a decade old at least now, where they sort of suggest looking at changes in the fit indices, and they sort of make the case that, like, oh, well, if the TLI or the CFI only goes down by like 0.01 points, it's close enough, but again, it's also kind of all made up. I mean, they did a simulation study and stuff, but all of these recommendations are just sort of people taking their best guess at like what makes sense. I don't know. Did I beat this to death or?
Yeah, no, I think that, that's, it's fine. Yeah, I think your answer is not really there.
Like, there is not one fit index that I would prioritize above the rest. I would never be I think, so I was giving a talk at AERA, and one of the things that I said is, and it's probably good advice here, like when you're doing analyses, be a lawyer, not an accountant. Do you know what I mean by that? So like, don't just count p-values or look for like thresholds or whatever. Like, we need to be more thoughtful than that, right? So what you're doing is you're holistically taking all of the evidence that you have and trying to make a judgment about what's the best model given all of the information and all of the evidence that you've accumulated. And you also kind of want to be your own worst critic a little bit, right? Rather than just sort of selectively choosing things to present to the world that put you in the best possible light, you should really be trying to run your theories through the traces and be a tough critic before you sort of unleash those things on the world, right? But yeah, so there isn't one magical fit index.
There's something about the models that we're testing that like would make us prefer one over the other.
Well, again, different fit indices perform better or worse in different cases. With the incremental fit indices, I think I mentioned that the one downside potentially, and there's a lot of research going on with this too, but one downside to incremental fit indices for things like when you have the mean structure, and again, is like, what is the baseline model in terms of mean structure? So like, it's obvious what the worst possible model is in the variance covariance model framework. It's like a model where you're estimating all the variances freely, but you're constraining the covariances to be 0. Remember when we talked about that baseline model? That's what it is. But like, what should the baseline model be for the mean vector? It doesn't really make sense to say all the means have to be 0, right? But if you say you freely estimate all the means, then that's actually saturated. That's a saturated model in terms of the mean structure, right? So like, this is a reason that, people have been kind of, I think, doing more thinking about what's the best way to sort of think about incremental fit indices for like growth curve models, for example. So that might be a reason that I would not, I might be less inclined to use incremental fit indices for growth models. RMSEA, actually, Dave and I did a couple of papers on this. RMSEA does not perform well with really, really low degrees of freedom. So if you got like 1, 2, or 3 DF models, I would stay away from the RMSEA. It really performs quite poorly. And, I won't get into why that is, but it kind of makes sense. So yeah, there definitely are times where things, work better or worse. I think SRMR tends to be a little bit biased when you have very small sample sizes, which again kind of makes sense if you think about it, because it's sort of this residual. It's really the residuals, and so yeah. So yeah, there are different fit indices do perform better or worse under certain conditions. But again, I think in my mind, that's all the more reason to report and compute chi-square, report and compute these fit indices, and just be critical. Yeah, Amanda.
Kind of follow up on the chi-square difference test. Nesting, can non-recursive and recursive be nested together, or are they totally separate? Can they ever be difference tested together?
Theoretically, you could have a non-recursive and recursive model that could be nested. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
So with these types of models, aspirationally, I would be fluent talking about them all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if on the final, will these be like labeled as such? Are we like identifying which type of model that we're seeing? Like how
Oh yeah, it's not going to be like this is not like a vocabulary test. So yeah, no, it's not going to be like here's a picture, name that model. It's not going to be like that.
So we should like.
So I might say something like, imagine you have an autoregressive model with 5 time points, right? And blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So in that case, you should be able to like think, oh, autoregressive model with 5 time points. Okay, that's the model where I've got time. We write like that.
Okay.
But I'm not gonna. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I'm not like gonna be testing you about, do you know the names of these models?
So I feel like early on when we talked about, whenever we were talking about measurement models and the structure of portional models,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to clarify this. I think you said something about how like the structural portions of the just identified or like measurement models, those always have 0 degrees of freedom. And I just
Yeah. So if you've got a hybrid model and you're fitting the just identified portion of it, right? That the just identified. So if it's a path model and it's just identified, it has 0 degrees of freedom. If it's a structure, if it's a hybrid model, so maybe it's got latent variables, but if the structural part is just identified, there are 0 degrees of freedom in the structural part.
right, even if maybe like because we've had some models where instead of the structural part being all latent, sometimes we have like indicator variables in there.
Yeah, but I mean,
I could count
you could have in the structural model observed and latent variables in combination in the structural model, right? But and that's fine. But I'm just saying, like, when you see a model that is, let's see, can I draw on? I should try to draw on here. Let's see. Will it give me a smart notebook? Oh, looks like it's working. Maybe. Or not. Come on. Oh, there it is. Is that right? Okay, here we go. How do I get it bigger?
Put the marker
Instead of
down
here.
first. Put the.
Oh yeah, put the marker down.
Just a big box.
The big box next to
Yeah.
The big box. Oh, this thing. Yeah, there we go. Ha! Look at that. Okay, that's good. Okay, so imagine you got something like this. Right? Like this. Okay. La la la. Okay, something like that, right? Oh, wait. Right, so the question is, so this is like a hybrid model. Is this a just identified? Is the structural part just identified? No, that's right. Why not? So like we don't have anything going from here. Oh, I should have changed the color, right? But I don't have anything going from there to there. I don't have anything going from there to there. Right? Now is it just identified? Did I make them? Did I? Let's see.
Yeah.
I think so, right? Okay. So now back to your questions. Now we've got a just identified structural model, right? So, yeah, what was your question? Remind me of your question so I can answer it.
I was just double checking because I thought that the rule of thumb was like, okay, if you have a just identified structural model, then it's always going to be 0.
For the structural part.
Yeah.
For the structural part. So like right now, this model has 0 DF for the structural part, right? But it does not, if you were to run this, it's not going to be a 0 DF model, right? Because we've got lots of DF in the measurement part, right? But so what you said is true. If you've got a just identified structural model, the degrees of freedom are going to be 0 for the structural part, but not maybe necessarily for the total model. If it's just a just identified path model, it'll be 0 degrees of freedom for the structural part and for the whole thing. But if it's a just identified structural model that's a hybrid model, the degrees of freedom for the structural part are 0, but the degrees of freedom for the measurement part are not 0, right? And that's one of the reasons that we run the measurement model first, remember, and we kind of get the measurement model in as good a shape as we can, and then we move to the just identified hybrid model and like make our structural sort of, work through our structure sort of taxonomy of structural models from there.
variables have either a disturbance or an error?
Yeah, well, yes, and I didn't draw any of those,
Oh,
so,
that's fine, I just didn't know if like for the test, we
yeah,
have to manually count them.
yes. All endogenous variables will have errors, or will have residuals, either errors or disturbances. Right? It's a really ugly
So,
picture.
In order to determine if the structural part of the model has good fit,
Uh-huh.
you need to ensure that in the CFA has, you have to establish first if the CFA, the measurement model has good fit, otherwise we can't determine it, or I guess, sorry.
Well, I guess I would say, like, I guess what I was kind of arguing for is that we can kind of disentangle a bit the fit of the measurement model and the fit of the structural model, right? So we could have a model. Let's just say this is our model, right? Let's say this is our model, and let's say that my chi-square is, I don't know, a bunch, 300, I don't know, whatever. How much of that chi-square of 300 is coming from the structural part of the model? 0, because the structural part of the model is just identified. So none of the misfit in this model would be coming from the structural portion. All of the misfit would be coming from the measurement portion. And that's why I think it's so important to really think about the measurement model first and sort of solve any problems you can in the measurement model. And then also just understand that when we look at the model fit of a hybrid model, there, some of the misfit comes from the structural part, some of the misfit comes from the measurement part. Now, in this case, none of the misfit would come from the structural part because the structural part is just identified, right? But imagine you had a model that had 1 degree of freedom in the structural part, and the chi-square is 300. Well, if you haven't sort of considered what the fit of the just identified structural model is, or the measurement model, then you don't really have a sense of how much of that chi-square of 300 comes from that 1 degree of freedom in the structural part, and how much of that chi-square of 300 comes from the measurement part. And that's why I think it's really important to start by looking at the measurement model first, so that we really can kind of disentangle whether our fit comes from measurement problems or structural problems, And that's kind of the logic of, why I kind of gave you the strategies that I did for thinking through how to build and fit these models. Yes, Hannah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So, and also, in terms of like the paths to equations, things like that, path equations are always going to be regression equations. And are we ever going to have to write equations for anything from like equation?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and something that's good to clarify. So, if it says something like, let's see, y equals, bx1 plus, I don't know, cx2 or something, right? Plus dy, let's say, that's the residual. Yeah, I mean, these are always paths, right? And there's nothing in the equations actually that says anything about correlation, which is why, I don't know if you notice, like on the homework and stuff, I always say things like, and all the exogenous variables are correlated with each other, and you should correlate the disturbances of y1 and y2 or whatever, because those correlations don't actually show up in the equations for the paths. So yeah, anytime you're writing equations for paths, those are like, these equations are really all about paths, not about correlations.
So we won't be expected to like figure out how to write equations for
No.
Okay.
No, and if I wanted you to draw a path diagram from a set of equations, I might give you a set of equations and then say, and make sure to correlate all of the exogenous variables when you draw your path diagram or something like that. Yeah.
When all of these when means and intercepts come into play, I know specifically obviously multiple groups and the growth model, but why not here? Why don't we consider means?
I mean, you could if you wanted to. So generally speaking, what actually happens when you're running M+, especially if you have any missing data whatsoever, but M plus will actually run a model where it estimates means and intercepts, right? But it'll estimate means and it'll estimate means and intercepts such that that portion of the model is just identified. So like imagine a single group model, right? And if you have a CFA model in a single group, what we do is we constrain the mean of the factor to be 0, and then we estimate all of the intercepts, right? And then you would estimate means and intercepts for all of your so basically you end up estimating means and intercepts for all of your observed variables and not for any of your latent variables, for example, in a single group model. And so it just ends up working out that they just don't enter into the model because we estimate as many means and intercepts as we have means and intercepts. And so it's like a 0 DF proposition, right? But also we're not all of the questions that we were asking, they really had nothing to do with means and intercepts. They were all really about sort of, direct and indirect and total effects and relationships and things like that. So, I mean, you can have them. It's not a problem, but in this model, you'll have means and intercepts, but we just generally don't really have to, we don't really have to think about them very much, basically, until we get into the multiple groups and the latent growth curve models, because there it gets a lot more complicated. Otherwise, they're just sort of in the background, usually. But I mean, how much do you think about means and intercepts in regression modeling, right? I mean, it's not that different. How much time did you really spend thinking about the intercept in a regression model? Not much, right? Usually. Maybe when you had moderation you did or whatever, but it was there, Katie.
For the path diagram,
Mm-hmm.
it's safe to assume that you want that those should be the observed variables and not latent variables. Would you specify with this added?
Oh yeah, I mean yes, because you would, yeah, I would specify. I mean, there's a way I could. When you say specify, I'm trying to think, are you thinking diagram to equation or equation to diagram?
Equation to diagram.
I mean, because theoretically I could do that, right? But think about it. I'd be saying x1 equals factor 1 plus error, x2 equals factor 1 plus error, x3 equals factor 1 plus error. Right? And then you'd know factor 1 is the factor, and you see what I'm saying? And it predicts x1, x2, and x3. Okay. So I could do that, and then you would know it's a factor. But if I just said x1 predicts x2, then you should assume they're just observed variables. Yeah. And so you would be able to tell if they're factors, because they would sort of, yeah.
Do we need to do anything? I know we talked about how you get standardized loadings by doing all those correlation type.
I don't think I asked you to go from unstandardized to standardized loadings in the exam.
Right.
Is that the question?
Yeah, essentially I was remember that there were several different correlational things that we could do.
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard, right? It's not hard to do that. To go from unstandardized to standardized regression equations or unstandardized to standardized factor loadings, but it's not a very computational exam. So there's nothing that asks you to do that.
Oh, does that also mean that we won't have to calculate the million?
Well, okay, so there might be a little computation on the exam.
All right.
There could be some tracing rule kind of computation on the exam. Yes.
So I just want a better handle on the model implied correlations and total effects. Because I think when I start thinking about the differences, I get too in the weeds, and if you could just give a really big overview.
Sure.
Of the differences, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so this is yeah, I think this is something that people sometimes get confused about. Let's take a simple model, and then we'll have a measurement model just to make it easier.
I want to be able to know the difference between before looking at my notes on the slide where you I just.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's see, this is x1, x2, So those are correlated. I should have probably made these squares. Sorry. We're not going to worry about the measurement part of the model. I'm going to make them circles, but we're just thinking about the structural part here. Okay. And then let's say this is X3. Okay. And this is X4. Let's do that. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Right? Okay. So let's start by thinking about the direct. Well, let's do like direct, indirect, and total effects. So let's do X1 to X4, right? So is there a direct effect from X1 to X4? No. So the direct effect of X1 to X4, right, is equal to 0. Okay, great. Is there? Oh, I should have made like A, B, C. We'll call that R. There we go. Is there an indirect effect from X1 to X4? Yes, right? So the indirect effect, X1 to X4, is equal to A times C, right? Plus. No, indirect effect. That's it. That's the essential difference. Direct, indirect, and total effects are all about regressions, not about correlations. The model implied correlation figures in the correlation. So this is real. And think about what it'll help if you think about what this is really said. These effects, and again, it sounds so causal, and I don't mean it to sound as causal as it sounds, but when we're talking about these direct, indirect, and total effects, the direct effect of X1 on X4 is really the effect of X1 on X4 after controlling for the other variables that are also influencing X4, or after controlling for the other variables in the model, right? So the direct effect of X1 on X4 here is 0 in this model, right? I mean, that's because there is no direct effect. But that doesn't mean that the model implied correlation and actually, that doesn't mean the model implied correlation of X1 on X4 is 0, right? And we know that because we know that the indirect effect of X1 on X4 is A times C. But that also is the effect of X1 on X4 via this mediator X3, right? But it isn't, it isn't necessarily, it isn't the same as the model implied correlation because again, like this A path, I think the best way to think about this is this A path is the effect of X1 on X3 after controlling for X2, right? So it's really like, how much of an independent contribution does X1 make on X3 after controlling for X2? So that's what this A path is. But that isn't the same thing as how correlated are X1 and X3 with each other, right? So direct, indirect, and total effects are really all about just the paths. And the paths are always these partial regression coefficients after controlling for the other stuff. And we're often really interested in that. Like, that's important. So now the total effect, obviously, here is just going to be A times C, right? And that tells me, what's the total effect of X1 on X4 in this model, right? After controlling for, again, after controlling for X2, if X2 weren't here, right, this A path would conceivably be bigger. But it is here, right? So this is a partial regression coefficient. So now, what's the model implied correlation between X1 and X4? Well, it's still going to be, so now we've got the correlation between X1 and X4, and it's still going to be A times C. But now this is where I'm also going to use the correlations, right? So what are all the ways I can get from X1 to X4, right? And this is one way. And then the other way is to go from x1 to x2, x2 to x3, and x3 to x4. So now that would be R times B times C. Right? But again, those are different numbers, but they're telling us different things. This is saying, hey, how correlated are how much is the model implied correlation between x1 and x4 in my model? And it could be the case that like I could have a variable that is really correlated with lots of other variables. And so like when you look at the effects, it doesn't look that strong, but the model implied correlation is actually still pretty big, right? So this is really like how correlated are x1 and x4? But like over what's the model implied correlation, right? Not the sample correlation, but what's the model implied correlation? And of course, this becomes really important because when we think about like our model implied variance covariance matrix, it is the unstandardized version of this, right? This is really what we're using for like the model implied variance covariance matrix, but again, in an unstandardized format. And this is just really saying like, okay, well, after controlling for those other variables in the model, how much of an effect is there of x1 on x4? Yeah.
So to check my work, that correlation at the top should be in my covariance matrix when I check to look between x1 and x4.
Yeah, well, technically it's correlation. So yeah, when like, yeah, you do it slightly differently. If it's unstandardized, you got to take into account the variances. But yeah, this would be like, if you look at the model implied correlation matrix, this is what it should give you.
The total of those two terms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And those are the standardized coefficients.
Yeah. So you use the standardized coefficients, and then you could look at the model implied correlation matrix. Yes.
There was a rule about like not going through a correlation twice, or only going through one correlation in a tracing rule. So if you have like a third variable, we can't like go through this correlation.
Oh yeah. So that's exactly what that rule means. So if you have something like this, let's say, you can't go like, you can't go like ba-doom, ba-doom. Like that's what it means, like not more than one curved arrow. Like you can't go hopping from curved arrow to curved arrow without like, you could go from this here, and if there were a curved arrow that went from here, you could go here, but you can't go like doo-doo, doo-doo. Like that doesn't really make sense.
So if there was a direct cut from x3 on x4, that just wouldn't.
So like if there were, now I've made a big mess of this, but hold on a second. So let me get rid of this. But like, let's say I had this, right? Let's say I have these correlations. Okay, so right, so I would have, so I'm doing x1 on x4, right? So I could go x1 to x3, we'll call this R2, let's say, and this will be D. So then I would have R2 times D, right? Would get added in here, but I wouldn't do like, let's say R1 times R3 times D. That's what it means by like not more than one curved arrow. Yeah?
Is there any instance where we would need to go through the same arrow twice? So like we're going in.
Well, and you can't really go, I mean, that's the other thing. You can't really just they're not supposed to go through the same arrow twice, right? So you can't go like.
I feel like in the earlier assignment we had with the very complicated model, there was a question about like in my mind when I was doing it.
Yeah, like, and again, I'm not talking about like with the compounding, but like you wouldn't go like that, right? Like you wouldn't go, I mean, so you're going through, but you're not going to go through the same arrow twice in the one piece of the trace, right? You might go through the same arrow twice, like as you're adding these different pieces up, but not, you know what I mean? But not for a single trace, yeah. You're not going to go through the same arrow twice, yeah.
But you cannot go to the same variable twice. So you cannot go from x3 to x2 to x1 to x3 again to go to x4.
Right.
So in this example, as it started, the direct effect was 0. If the direct effect was a non-zero value, the total effect would be adding that term.
Yeah, exactly. So if we had this,
And the
right,
model
and this is
implied
E,
correlation-
then we'd add that term in too to get the total effect.
And then the model implied correlation's first term, before the RBC would be the total effect with the D. Like it would be AC plus D plus RBC.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so everything that goes into the total effect is also gonna go into the model implied correlation, right? Yeah.
Okay.
But the model implied correlation could have other terms as well.
And that's
Right.
the tricky part, I think, harkening from that homework stuff. What was like how many other parts there were to the model implied correlation.
Yeah. Well, it can be kind of, yes, it can be kind of tricky sometimes if the model is big, especially, so.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but can you go through correlated disturbances? Calculate the model implied correlation?
Oh,
They are
yeah.
Correlated.
Let's just. Okay, so let's say we have. D1 and D2. And let's say that they're correlated, right? And let's see here. Maybe I shouldn't make that X1 and X2. Oh well, I'll make this W1 into 2. There we go. Let's say something like that, okay? So let's say I wanted to say, what is the model implied correlation between X1 and X2? So how can you get from X1 to X2? And let me label these things. A, B, C, and let's say R, okay? These are actually going to be straight to B1. So how can we get, how can we figure out the model implied correlation between X1 and X2? Well, A, C, B, right? Does everybody see that? A times C times B plus R, right?
And that would be interpreted as.
The model implied correlation between X1 and X2. Right? And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, like A times C times B is really just going to give you, right? Like there's this piece of X1 that's not explained by W, and there's this piece of X2 that's not explained by W2, right? And those pieces are actually correlated with each other. So if we want to know what like the correlation between X1 and X2 is, I mean, this sort of gives us, the piece of, you know, how correlated sort of the piece of X1 that's explained by W1, right? The piece of X2 that's explained by W2, and then they've got their correlation, how much that is. But like, if there's also a correlation between these two things after controlling for W1 over here and W2 over here, that's what this is, right? So I need to add that in so I actually get the full model implied correlation between X1 and X2. Yes?
You can't do any kind of going from X1 through the disturbances to X2 because it violates the going forward and backwards and forward.
Well, I actually did just do that. I did just do that. That's how I got the R. I went.
No, I meant like.
I did this.
Yeah. Oh wait. And then keep and then.
But now,
Yeah,
see, right?
yeah.
But now, see, these arrows are pointing this direction, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So I'm like, yeah. So now I'm kind of stuck.
You can go backwards, forward, backwards.
Yeah. You remember I said you can go like backward and then forward, but not forward and then backward or whatever. So like, if you look at the way that these arrows run, you can see, and that's kind of the nature of the disturbance, right? Like these guys, you get stuck here, right? Can't go that way, right? And these guys get stuck here. They can't kind of go in there. And that's sort of, if you think about it, the nature of the model, right? Like the disturbances are that piece that's not explained by these guys, right? So we kind of partitioned it out into like these sort of two different parts of the model in some sense.
So there are no direct or indirect effects in X1 and X2 here.
Yes, that's right. So very good point. So if somebody said, what's the direct effect of X1 on X2? There is none. What's the indirect effect? There is none. What's the total effect? There is none. But there is a model implied correlation between x1 and x2, and that would be A times C times B plus R. The effects are really all about these partial regression coefficients. And partial regression coefficients are always about after controlling for the other things in the model, right? And that's really, and we're often really interested in that. Like, because, yeah, okay, all these things are correlated. I want to know, after controlling for the other stuff in the model, how, like, right? This A is like, after controlling for W2, how well does, you know, actually, I'm not really controlling for it very well there, am I? But, like, if I had this, right? How, after controlling for W2, how well does W1 predict X1?
With the indirect effect though, like tracing rules, you can go backwards and then forwards, so why can't you do ACB for an indirect effect?
Well, you can do ACB, but it's just not an indirect effect. Because it's a correlation. You got a correlation in there. The effects don't have any correlations. They're just paths.
Right.
That's the really important thing. So you can totally go ACB for a model implied correlation. The big thing to remember is that the model implied correlations are really so super important, because that's really sort of what's going to tell us about how well the model fits. But again, like, I think especially when we're thinking about mediation models and things like that, people often talk about direct, indirect, and total effects. And that really is, what's the effect of this variable on this variable after controlling for the other stuff that's going on, right? And so the curved arrows are not going to enter into those. So I think that's the important thing to remember. Like, if you remember nothing else about the difference between effects and model implied correlations for the exam, remember, when you're doing model implied correlations, you're going to use the curved arrows, right? You're going to use the correlational paths to come up with the model implied correlations. But for direct, indirect, and total effects, you're not, right? It's really all about the regression coefficients, the paths. It's the set of paths that are going to determine the direct, indirect, and total effects without those correlations. And sometimes they could be the same, right? Because, like, if we didn't, we didn't have a curved arrow, right? Like, I think for some of the examples we did in the beginning of the semester, there weren't any curved arrows. It was something like this. Let's just say, like, in this case, the model implied correlations are going to be the same as the direct, like not direct. The model implied correlations are going to be the same as the total effects in this case, because there aren't any curved arrows, right? So sometimes they could be the same, but not always, obviously. All right, other questions? Yeah.
The previous diagram we just had.
Okay, which I probably don't remember anymore, but go ahead.
When we're interpreting like the effect of the W on the X, there's nothing to control for there.
Oh yeah, because how do I have it? I have it like, let's see, I think I remember how I did it. I think I did like this. Right, it was like this. So let's call this A, let's call this B, and these were correlated, right? W1, W2, X1, X2. Right, and that, that is true, right? This actually isn't like the partial regression coefficient after controlling for W2, because I'm not actually allowing for there to be a path from W2 to X1. So, like, I would hope that you would have fit a just identified model to, like, determine that you don't really need that path, right? But let's assume that we did. That's right. Like, this, yeah, you're absolutely right. All right, other questions? Yes.
I have a question about multi-group.
Okay.
So I understand kind of going from the configural to the metric.
Mm-hmm.
Constraining the factor loader.
Okay.
But I have more difficulty interpreting constraining the intercepts and how to look at and how to interpret that.
Sure. Yeah, so when we go from the metric to when we go from the configural to the metric. That's right. We're constraining the loadings to be equal, not constraining the intercepts to be equal. So we're just saying that like the sort of the factor loading, right? So the strength of, how well does the factor predict the response to this item? That is equal across the groups, right? So the factor loadings are equal across the groups. When we get to the intercepts, to scalar invariance, then we're really, so first, we're never going to look at scalar invariance unless we've been able to constrain those factor loadings to be equal, right? But now that we've constrained the factor loadings to be equal, if we're constraining the intercepts to be equal, then really what we're saying is that basically people who have similar who are similar in terms of the factor. So let's say it's verbal ability or something. So people from the two groups who have the same verbal ability, if we can constrain the intercepts to be equal, then we're saying that those people from two groups who have the same level of verbal ability, we would expect to score the same on that item. Okay? And if we can't constrain them to be equal, then we're saying that people with the same amount of verbal ability, they don't score the same on the item, that they score differently on the item. So basically, like, let's go back to my example about like bracelet and slumber. So again, let's assume we could have, we meet metric invariance. So if I find that the intercept for slumber is higher for girls than boys, it's saying like girls and boys who have similar verbal ability, the girls tend to do better on the slumber item than the boys do, even after controlling for their ability level, right? And that's what makes thinking about the intercepts different from just thinking about the item means. So like I could, before I ever run a model, look at the mean on slumber for girls and boys, let's say. And maybe I see that the mean on slumber is higher for girls than boys. Well, there are two reasons that could be the case. Probably more than two, but two that I'm thinking of. One is that girls just have higher verbal ability than boys. And so they generally score higher on all the items than boys. And so it's no surprise that they scored higher on slumber, right? The other possibility is that after you control for verbal ability, girls still score higher on that item than boys. That's more problematic, right? Because like, I want to make sure that these items function the same way across the two groups before I start comparing the two groups. Because like, if I have an item, let's say like slumber, where girls sort of get the natural advantage, and I don't sort of recognize that, right? Then I'm going to end up like, again, so imagine that item stays on the scale. Girls score way higher than boys on it. I compute a subscale mean, and girls end up doing better on my vocabulary test because slumber was in there. That's a problem, right? But again, this intercept thing, and I think this is really important. The intercept isn't saying that the mean on slumber is higher for girls than boys. Which it probably is, but what it's really saying is after holding ability constant. So like holding ability constant, the mean is higher for girls than boys. So boys and girls who have equal ability levels, I expect girls to do better on that item than boys, which is a problem, right? Because they have equal ability levels. So theoretically, girls and boys with equal ability levels should do equally well on all of the items. There shouldn't be some items that girls do better on than boys, even when they have the same ability level, right? It should be that people who are doing better on the items are doing better on the items because they have more ability. Not, you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So that's the really important distinction with intercepts, is that it's like a conditional mean. It's like the mean on the item holding ability level constant at at 0, let's say, on overall and across the two groups. And that's what makes it useful and helpful.
And contrasting that to just constraining the loading.
Well, the constraining the loading is really about the relationship between the factor and the item. And those are two different things. So like it could be the case, and actually going back to slumber was an example where actually both things were different. So it was that the loading was lower for girls than boys. And the reason that was is because, remember, the loading is sort of telling you about how well does this item discriminate between sort of high and low, people who are high and low on the factor, right? So like a high loading means it's a highly discriminating item. It means that the relationship between the factor, this ability factor, and the item is really strong. So if the loading is lower for girls than boys, let's say the loading's near 0 for girls and it's quite high for boys. What that means is that for boys, your level of verbal ability, like your verbal ability really predicts whether you know the word slumber or not. But for girls, your level of verbal ability basically is it doesn't predict whether you know slumber or not. And that's because all the girls knew slumber because they knew about slumber parties. So girls with low ability and girls with high ability, vocabulary ability, all the girls knew slumber. And so it didn't actually differentiate sort of high and low verbal ability girls. But for boys, maybe unless they had sisters, I don't know, I'm making stuff up now. But for boys, they did actually differentiate high and low ability boys because, so the loading was stronger for boys. And then the intercept was higher for girls. So like there were two problems with the item. But the loading is really like about the relationship between the factor and the item. So the relationship, like verbal ability did actually predict response to slumber in boys, but it didn't really predict response to slumber in girls. That's the loading. And then, right, or the metric invariance, and then the scalar invariance is really about that intercept, that conditional mean. Does that make sense?
So
yeah.
In the same time, when you were saying that if the means are different, this means one of two things. We're talking about like the observed mean just from the data. Like if the mean on slumber for boys is different from.
Yeah, like so you could see that from the data, but that doesn't necessarily tell you that the intercept's going to be different.
Yeah, so like the intercept thing is just one option here that explains that difference in the mean.
Right. Right. Like the reason that, yeah. So I guess what I was saying is there are two reasons that the mean on that item could be different. One is, yeah, this item, right? The intercepts are different, which is what we just talked about. And the other is just like girls have higher verbal ability than boys, so they tend to do better on all the items, right? And so when it's not really about any particular item being problematic. It's just that, they have a higher mean on verbal ability. I'm making this up, by the way. Please don't think that I'm saying anything that's true, but like, so yeah, so and that's the thing. So if you just see that the item has a higher mean in one group than another, you don't really know if that's because the item is functioning differently, or maybe really one group is doing better on that factor than another group, right? So other questions? Yes.
Also shifting gears to, I wonder if you could do an overview of the 3 types of longitudinal and sort of what the key distinguishers are and why we would do one versus the other.
3 types of longitudinal?
So the third one is the nonlinear, the polynomial.
Oh, I don't think of that as a different type. Okay. So like we talked about two very different kinds of longitudinal models. We talked about autoregressive models, right? Where I am today is predicted by where I was yesterday, remember? So we talked about and we talked about the importance of the stability coefficient, right? And generally speaking, in autoregressive models, there's really not much interest sort of in means and intercepts. It's really about sort of the strength of the relationship or the stability across time. And then the other type of longitudinal model that we talked about were growth curve models. And it has a very, very different kind of, makes a totally different set of assumptions about how to predict people's item scores across time, right? And so for the growth curve models, we have set up a latent intercept variable and one or more latent slope variables, right? And so we're really predicting people's scores. And now here, means are going to enter into the equation. So means and intercepts. We're really trying to predict sort of people's growth across time, or their scores across these multiple time points, using this latent intercept, which really captures sort of again, it depends on how you center the intercept, but the most common way is to center at the start of the study, or so where do people start? And then we have like a growth, one or more growth parameters, some sort of slope parameter, and so how fast do people grow, right? And if you think about it, I mean, that's one of the really interesting things about a growth curve model is that we actually are over-identified in terms of the mean structure. So what we do in a growth curve model usually is we try to predict. Let's just draw something here. Yeah, like we don't usually think about the mean structure at all for the autoregressive models, so that's a big difference. And with the growth curve models, we're so interested in the mean. And let's just say we've got, say this is intercept and this is slope. Okay, here we go, intercept and slope. Make a little variance things there. Right, okay, so there we go. So, I mean, how many intercepts, or how many elements of our mean vector are there? So how many pieces of mean information do we have? 3, right? Because we have whatever this variable is at time 1, time 2, and time 3. But remember, when we fit a growth curve model, we're going to get the parameters we're most interested in. We're going to get, I'm going to do this too. Remember, these are going to be 1s. Let's say this is a linear model, so it's 0, 1, 2. So the parameters we're most interested in are the mean for the intercept, right? And the variance of the intercept, and the mean of the slope, and the variance of the slope, and then the covariance or the correlation between the intercept and the slope, right? So those are 5 parameters, and if you think about it, all those 5 parameters are actually happening up in this part of the model. So we've got a mean and variance for the intercept, mean and variance for the slope, covariance between the intercept and the slope, and then down here, we actually constrain what we do in a growth model. We can't actually allow all these intercepts to freely vary, right? Because we only have 3 pieces of information about the mean and the intercept. So we constrain the intercepts, and this gets confusing because there's intercept up here, but I'm talking about the intercepts for these T1, T2, and T3 to equal 0. Okay, so we don't estimate any intercepts here. These are constrained to be 0. And then we have these errors, and here's where we have sort of a decision to make. We could either constrain all of those error variances to be equal across time, which would mean that we're estimating 1 residual variance, or we could actually allow those error variances to vary across time, right? So if we constrain them to be equal across time, then we're going to have 1 error variance, right? Or if we allow them to freely vary across time, we're going to be estimating 3 error variances. If we estimate 3 error variances, well, we have 3, right? We have, forget about remember, we have to we have to think about identification for the mean structure and the variance covariance structure separately. So if we estimate 3 error variances, how many degrees of freedom would we have for the variance covariance part of the model? Yeah, right, so we'd have 3 error variances. We'd have a variance for the intercept, a variance for the slope, and the covariance. So that's another 3, right? So 3 plus 3 is 6, right? And we have 3 variables. So how many knowns do we have in the variance covariance part? 3 times 4 divided by 2 is 6. So in the variance covariance structural part, if we estimate 3 error variances, we have 0 degrees of freedom for the variance covariance part of the model. But we don't actually have 0 degrees of freedom overall. Why? How many degrees of freedom do we have in total for this model? I'm estimating a mean for the intercept. I'm estimating a mean for the slope. I'm constraining these three to be 0. How many pieces of mean information do I have? 3. How many am I using up in this model? 2. So how many degrees of freedom do I have? 1, exactly. So in this model, if I don't constrain the error variances to be equal, the variance covariance portion is just identified, but the mean structure portion is not. It has 1 degree of freedom. So if I allow these error variances to freely vary, this model has 1 degree of freedom. And that 1 degree of freedom is actually coming from the mean structure part of the model, not the variance covariance sort of part of the model, right? So the question is basically, how well can I estimate how well can I estimate people's scores at time 1, time 2, and time 3, those 3 scores, by just using the 2 parameters of intercept and slope? And so remember, I said like a person's score at time 1, what would be the model predicted score at time 1? Well, it would just be the mean of the intercept, right? So the time 1 score is just going to be like the mean of the intercept, right? Because you got the intercept, 1. So like whatever the mean is, it's just going right into time 1. Slope here, this is 0. So at time 1, it doesn't enter in. What would the predicted score at time 2 be? The mean of the intercept plus 1 times the mean of the slope, right? Because now you've got this intercept plus 1 times the slope. And then at time 3, if you wanted to come up with the predicted score at time 3, it's going to be the mean of the intercept plus 2 times the mean of the slope, right? And so basically I'm saying I can reproduce these 3 pieces of mean information just using 2 parameters. And if I can do that, then the model will fit well. And if I can't, because like maybe they don't increase linearly, because again, think about the assumption I'm making here is that they're like increasing linearly. If I can do this, then the model will fit well. If I can't do this, the model won't fit well. But really the model misfit is sitting in the mean structure, which is kind of cool, different a little bit. Okay, so that's a linear growth. That's a linear growth model. We talked about we talked about a few different ways you can fit growth curve models, and we talked about the simplest is a linear growth model. We also talked about polynomial growth models like quadratic and cubic growth, and we talked about piecewise growth models, right? So it's like multiple it's like separate pieces of linear models, if you will. So I showed you how to, again, there are more types, there are even more ways you can think about fitting growth models, but those are 3 sort of very common types of growth models. They're all growth models, but so if you think you have a linear growth model, then this works great. If you think there's some sort of nonlinearity, then you might want to deal with it using either like a piecewise growth model or a polynomial growth model. Or again, there are, other options too, but not for us this semester. Those are our options. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Other questions? So remember too that, so I've posted the extra credit homework assignment. It's up already, should be visible. Let me know if it's not. And that is due, so it's extra credit, so do it yourself, right? And that is due by 9 a.m. next Wednesday, and there won't be any extensions for the extra credit because grades just need to get done. and because I'll grade them during the exam. That'll be nice, something to do. So, right? It's like a good thing to do. So, yeah, so those are due 9 a.m. You can have till Friday to finish the non-recursive without penalty, but the extra credit is due in a week. Less than a week now, I guess. A week minus 3 hours. Yes. Oh, you want to talk about those?
Well, what, yeah, well, you.
Yeah, we could. Yeah. Well, somebody said, yeah, well, let's talk about those. If I have a copy, do I have a copy still? Maybe. What do I do with them? Did I hand them all out? Is there an extra copy of those anywhere? That's true. I thought I needed enough. Let's see. Hold on.
The one down there.
The one down there? Yes. All right. Great. Okay. Well, there are a couple down here, actually. Okay, so. All right, so this is so it was requested to see a couple of examples of multiple choice type questions. Okay. So let's just look at these. Okay, the measurement model pictured above is just identified, over-identified, under-identified, or cannot be determined. Right. What do you think?
This one is like to look at. I always like when the measurement model can be like physically like separated. So this one's confusing to me because it's in every like visual tier of it.
Yeah, but remember the measurement model. So think about the way that I sort of guided you to sort of fitting models, right? So the first thing we would do is fit the measurement model, which is where we would allow all of the structural variables to correlate with each other, to be exogenous and to correlate with each other. So, you know, okay, now that I look at this, luckily this is not a question for the exam. This is not a measurement model pictured above. So that's maybe what's throwing you off. But like the measurement model of the model pictured above is what it really should say. So the measurement model of the model pictured above is just identified, over-identified, under-identified, or cannot be determined. Well, the structural part of the measurement model would be just identified, but the measurement model itself would be way over-identified, right? I mean, like measurement models are always way over-identified, generally speaking, unless you only have like one factor and 3 items. Think about all the degrees of freedom. Like imagine that you had linkages between F1, F2, F3, F4, and F5, right? So that there would be no structural degrees of freedom in the measurement model, right? But there would still be tons of degrees of freedom here, right? Because remember that you've got variable 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like you've got 16 variables here. Is that right? 15, they're just badly labeled. There's no V13, sorry. So 15, I was like 16, that doesn't make sense. There are 15 variables here. Right? So like, just think about that. Let's just think about the measurement part of the model. If you have 15 observed variables, right? How many unique elements are there in the variance covariance matrix? 15 times 16 divided by 2, right? Which is, 120. Are we estimating anywhere near 120 parameters? No. Right? So the measurement, so this as a measurement model, the measurement part of this model, right? That's really what it should say. It should say like the measurement, it's like hard to word that, but the measurement aspect of this model is going to be way over identified. The measurement part of the model. Yes.
Just to clarify, if we walk through this example, we have 10 paths, 15 endo error variances, 5 exo error variances, and then 10 covariances.
Okay, so you got 15 error variances, you're right. You've got, let's see, you would have, if it's a measurement model, you've got 5 factors, and so there would actually be 10 covariances among those 5 factors, right? So 15 error variances, 10 covariances among the 5 factors, And then there would be variances for each factor, although maybe I wouldn't count the variances for each factor. Maybe I'll pretend I'm doing fixed factor variances, because then I could count the 15 loadings, right? Because it'd be like 15 loadings, 15 error variances, 10 covariances, and then I fix the factor variances to 1. Yeah. Well, but I'm just like, in my head, I do it that way because it doesn't matter, right? Because they're going to be equivalent. I sometimes do it that way because it's just easier. Or I could count it as 5 factor variances, 10 loadings, which is now, again, 15. Doesn't matter which way you count it. 15 plus the 15 for the error variances plus the 10 for the covariances. So it's basically going to be either 15 plus 15 plus 10 or 5 plus 10 plus 15 plus 10, which gives us what? 40, exactly. So there would be 40 parameters that we're estimating out of 120. So the measurement part of this model has like 80 degrees of freedom, right? So again, like, and that's the kind of thing where I would expect that, like, yeah, if you see something like this, you'd be like, oh yeah, the measurement part of that model is way over identified. Like, you don't even have to count to know that at this point, I would think. You know? Does that make sense? Regardless of what's happening with the structural part of the model, a model like this, the measurement part's going to be way over identified, which again is where the misfit's going to come from. Now, how about the structural part of this model? What have we not spoken about? The second part? Yeah, that's where we're there now. So what about the structural model pictured above? Is that just identified, over identified, under identified, or cannot be determined? Okay. Well, is this a recursive or a non-recursive model? It's what? Non-recursive, right? Non-recursive. We got a feedback loop, and we've got the correlation between the disturbances.
So I thought there had to be a second variable coming in.
Yes, and you're right. We need you're right. Because I put the covariance, the disturbance covariance, I need an instrumental variable for each of both, F4 and F5. You're absolutely right. And I only have F3. But it actually gets even worse than that, because can F3 be an instrumental variable here? No, because it's got paths into, right? Or sorry, I'm sorry. F1 and F2. I take that back. F1 and F2 can serve as my instruments here. F3 cannot serve as an instrument because it's got paths leading in. But F1 and F2 could actually serve as instruments because there is no direct path from F1 to F2, potentially, right? And still, even so, that doesn't help me enough. Even if I wanted to say F1 and F2 could be instruments, why? Oh, no, actually, I could take that back. They could be instruments, so I think we would be okay. Yeah, I gotta be okay with that. I gotta think about this. I gotta think about whether I'd be okay with this. This is a bad one. This is a very tricky question. Okay, because if F1 and F2 are I think I could use F1 and F2 as instruments. Yeah, so I think I'm okay.
But don't you have to have? Don't you need to have a theoretical?
Well, yes. I mean, no. Yes. Of course, I need some sort of a theoretical framework. But like. Oh, I take that back. I'm right. Okay. I'm getting myself all mixed up. They can't be because there's no direct path from F1 to F4 and F1 to F5. Thank you. They can't be. It's under-identified. Good. That was my initial. Oh, I'm getting tired. Okay. So yes, not identified. We have no. So the point is we have no instruments here. If I put a direct path from F1 to F4 and from F2 to F5, then I would be identified. If I had a direct effect, right? Because then I could use. But I can't use them here, right?
So if we haven't gone over a model where they're both instrumental variables and predictors of another variable, does that work?
I know. Well, that's why this one actually gets really complicated, because your instrument doesn't necessarily, like, we've always done things where like there wasn't F3 here, right? Like there was no F3, and we've just done like, imagine if you had a path from F1 to F4 and F2 to F5. We had those direct effects, then F1 could be like an instrument for F5, and F2 could be an instrument for F4, right?
And there's also the mediation by F3. Is that possible?
But like here, this F3 has totally mucked up everything, because the biggest problem with F3 here is that it predicts both F4 and F5. So it doesn't help us in terms of identification at all. So remember, our identification rules are, remember I said like we can conceptually take out any variable that predicts both. I don't know if you remember that, but any variable that predicts both problematic causal variables, you could just like eliminate it and then ask yourself, are we okay? So when I conceptually eliminate F3, so that's what I did. And then for a minute, I forgot that we don't have paths from F1 and F2 to F4 and F5. I was like, oh, well, then we'd be okay. But we're not okay, right? Because there are no paths there. So yeah, so we're not okay. This is not identified. This is a totally problematic, non-identified structural model.
So that's in this
Yes.
case, would we call that under-identified or cannot be determined?
No, under-identified. Non-identified, under-identified, and unidentified are the same thing. It can be determined. This can be determined. It's not identified, right?
And the reason is because F4 and F5 do not have IDs. Like, is that like the...
Yeah, F4 and F, that's exactly right. F4 and the question is, do F4 and F5 have ID, instrumental variables? F3 can't serve as the instrumental variable because it predicts both, right? So yeah. So it's a problem. So that's super problematic.
Would you mind going over the counts for that example?
The counts
Yeah.
for what?
For the knowns versus.
For the knowns versus the unknowns in this non-recursive. So, I mean, we can, but here's the thing. Like in a non-recursive model, the question isn't whether the knowns are more than the unknowns. For a non-recursive model, the question is, are we identified? Like, do we have, and the most important question is, do we have an instrument that we can use? And the answer here is no. So like in a non-recursive model, you could have positive degrees of freedom and still be under-identified. And in fact, here that's probably the case, right? Because we don't have a path, we don't have a linkage from F1 to F4, F2 to F5, right? Yeah, you don't have to figure out in this question, you don't have to figure out that measurement model DF. You just have to recognize that this measurement model is going to be way over-identified. Like basically any multi-factor model is going to be over-identified as a measurement model. Any measurement model, unless it's like one latent factor with 3 indicators, is going to be over-identified. Like, so that's kind of easy. So in this case, I wasn't necessarily expecting you to compute the degrees of freedom, just to recognize that, like, oh yeah, like, you got a measurement model. There's a lot going on in the measurement model. You're going to pick up a lot of degrees of freedom in the measurement model. But the reality is, again, even though this thing would have, like, 80 degrees of freedom or maybe more, it still actually can't be fit. Right?
Because of the structural.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
yeah.
From just looking at this, though, right, not only would we have to have a variable going from F4, from something to F4 and something to F5, let's say that we did have direct paths from F1 to F4, F2 to F5.
So like if we had, yeah.
We would also, in order for it to be an instrumental variable, we also have to assume
there's no direct effect.
So how?
From the
instrument. Like if you were to ask a question about that, that would have to be specified as well.
Well, there is, yeah, you can see if there's no direct effect, right?
The arrows are different. Like, that's like what I'm...
Yeah. So the no direct effect means there's no path, right? Okay. So how about let's flip to the other side. So the model above is, this one's much easier. These are much more like, I think there's a reason why that last one is not on the exam, right? I think I was like, yeah, that's way too hard. Okay. So, but this one is more of the ilk of what you might see on the exam. So like, here we go. So the model above is it non-recursive and identified, non-recursive and non-identified, would be identified with the addition of an instrumental variable, or none of the above? A. So that's really easy, right? Because we've got And in fact, we actually don't even need two. We have two instruments here and we actually only need one, right? So
There's an option that says non-recursive and over-identified.
yeah, that's right. If there were an option that said non-recursive and over-identified, that would be right. So it's question. I mean, so these are the kinds of questions that you can expect. Again, like scratch number 2 on this. That one's way too complicated. I wouldn't give you anything that complicated for non-recursive model. But certainly something like this question, right? And understanding about measurement models being over-identified and sort of understanding the basics of identification for non-recursive models in the relatively simple terms. Yeah? I mean, they're not all going to have diagrams either. I feel like this was a little bit misleading because every question here had some sort of a diagram. But they're not all going to have diagrams. Some of them will just be words. And obviously, if there's something that's really, confusing, you can ask for clarification. But you can't ask for the answer, of course. Yes.
I'm also concerned about the capacity of the question prompts that you ask.
Capacity?
Like which of the 4 scenarios below is the definition of like keyword case? Oh, you're not. Okay.
I mean, it's not going to be about the definitions, really. It's much more like this kind of stuff. It's much more like, do you see what I mean by like, this is very conceptual. Like, do you understand sort of what we're doing, how we identify models, sort of how this stuff kind of works? The questions are much more of this kind of ilk. There's not going to be anything that's like a basic definition. How boring would that be, right? Oh, sorry. Okay. Other questions? Oh my God, it's 12:05 already. We never even took a break. Sorry about that. That's your last class. Yay! Any last minute questions?
One more thing pertaining to the discussion.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I just heard someone come through.
Oh, yes. You have a question?
Yeah, the discussion board before they get dismissed to let them know about the
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jocelyn. Okay. So a couple of things.
It should be up by 12:30.
Okay. Yeah. So we were thinking about like, what's the best way to kind of review for the exam and that kind of thing. So obviously we just did a big review session here. But rather than having office hours next week, we thought it might be helpful to create like a discussion board within Husky CT. And then you all can sort of ask, and we can, you all can help each other by answering, but we can also help answer questions that are in the discussion board. So rather than you emailing questions to me or to Jocelyn in the next week, post them to the discussion board, and then I can answer them. And that way everybody has the benefit of the answers rather than just one person. So I think that'll be good. And then there won't actually be office hours next Monday or Tuesday. I don't think we need them. I mean, I think we're good. I don't think we need necessarily another big review session because we've just kind of reviewed everything. But again, if other questions come up, just post them to the discussion board. We'll make sure those get answered. Did I cover that, Jocelyn?
Yep, it should be available starting at 12:30.
Okay, and the discussion board will be available in a few minutes. Yeah.
So, sorry, but I'm pushing back on that because sometimes the answer would be best with an illustration versus a textual response. Because you go back and forth. So I'm wondering if we could just do an online virtual session at a time that might be mutually helpful to folks in case you have to do a visual.
You can attach the
Yeah.
for them.
So as long as that helps, like there's.
Yeah, I have no problem with putting visuals up. I mean, I think it could be hard for us to find another time that works for everybody. That's one of my big concerns, and I don't kind of want to do it at a time that only works for half of you. I mean, if it becomes, again, if we run into some sort of issue and we need to do something at the beginning of next week, I mean, we can, but I don't know. How are you all feeling? Are you feeling freaked out? Okay, so some no's and some yeses. Just remember, it's open book.
Always freaked out, to be honest.
You're always freaked out?
It's all relative.
That's right. That's right. It's all relative. So what can you do to prepare? Just get your notes organized. Go through stuff. Maybe quiz each other a little bit. I don't know. Do the extra credit assignment if you're really worried, because that'll pick you up 4 points, right? By next Wednesday. That'll be helpful. I think actually the grades are generally pretty good very good going into the final for most people. So, I don't freak out too much. Don't overthink it. I mean, don't underthink it, but don't overthink it. Just think just right. Yes.
For the short answer, I know that you said that they're going to be like really short answers.
Yeah, they're like truly short answer. Like, I don't know that any of them involve even complete sentences.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I sometimes like have the worry that my answer is just like taking your words from the slide and like, do you know what I'm saying?
No, the short answer are much more revolve around, again, like things like, here are the equations, draw me the diagram. Here's a diagram, trace through and tell me what the model implied correlations are. That kind of. No, they're much more like identification, tracing rule, equation to picture kind of stuff. I don't think there's anything where you actually have to write anything of substance. Yeah. But those are just some of those are hard to do as multiple choice. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yes.
Just a question for the non-recursive models. We use all of the tools that we have learned, the blocking and all the tools that we have learned. It's just to understand if the model is identifier.
Yes.
Now, if I want to know if the model is over-identified, then I do the unknowns of that non-recursive. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess when you get to non-recursive, again, if you have a recursive model, with a recursive model, if the knowns are more than the unknowns, then we're set. It's identified, right? And you're so used to using that rule of thumb. But with a non-recursive model, knowing that the knowns are more than the unknowns doesn't necessarily get us to identification. So the question is the model identified? Like, looking at these problematic causal variables, is the model identified? It doesn't matter whether obviously if you have fewer knowns than unknowns, it's going to be then it's going to be unidentified whether it's recursive or non-recursive, clearly. But that's sort of we don't have to worry about. What we need to worry about is whether the model's identified. Not so much the knowns versus the unknowns, but whether the non-recursive model's identified. Yeah, exactly. With recursive models, the knowns versus unknowns thing it works great for us. And that's why we spent all semester kind of hammering that home. But with a non-recursive model, I could have more knowns than unknowns and still be under-identified. Right? So that's the thing. Like, knowing whether the knowns are more than the unknowns, that doesn't help me answer the question about, is my non-recursive model unidentified or not?
But if you find it to be identified, then how do you know if it's over-identified? Does that not matter in the model?
Well, it's going to kind of have to be over-identified. If you think about the way the instrumental variables work, there's no way I can have a just identified structural model, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So really, it's just about, have I identified my problematic causal variables or not? And that's really what you need to focus on for the non-recursive. Okay, last 3 minutes. Yes?
In terms of bringing notes, can we have notes on our laptop?
Yes. So yes, in terms of good question. So you can have notes on your laptop or on your, if you have any device you want, you can have notes on. I don't want you surfing the internet. Just think that's going to be a horrible waste of time mostly. And I don't want you phoning a friend. or texting a friend, as the case may be, right? So I don't want you using other people. I don't want you going online, but like you can have your device and be surfing your devices. I think that's fine. I know some of you have been very paper conscious all semester, and you should not be penalized for that, right? So yeah, so that's totally fine. And you can bring in whatever books you want. Again, like, but I think you can see like these kinds of questions, like you're gonna have everything you need in your notes, right? So I don't think they're gonna, you might want to bring your Klein book, but I don't think you need to bring you don't need to go to the library and get 10 SEM books out to bring to the exam. Like, it's probably just gonna slow you down, But, if you have another favorite SEM book that wasn't assigned or whatever, a favorite chapter or whatever, you can bring whatever resource you want. Whatever, and again, that's like the real world, right? Except for the part about not being able to phone a friend. So, because usually you can do that in the real world, but it's like the real world of exams. All right, 12:14. We better stop before we are totally out of time. All right. So I'll see you here next week. And as I said, I will be here. If anybody wants to start as early as 9, I will be here at 9, and I'll let you go until 12:30. And at that point, I'll put you out of your misery. Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. See y'all next week.
Hey Betsy, do you have a meeting after this?
No, I didn't save any changes. Stop recording. Stop.